of Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, marked the climax of a 6-day naval and air bombardment of Okinawa, just 360 miles south of the Japanese mainland. At the height of the offensive, thousands of troops of the U.S. 10th Army headed for the shore, expecting fanatical Japanese resistance. But as the first assault waves of U.S. Marines rushed off the landing craft, there was nothing. In an eerie calm, more troops arrived. It appeared that the capture of Okinawa might be easier than they thought. Unfortunately, it became the bloodiest and costliest battle of the Pacific conflict in World War II. In many places, the American attackers had to use flame-throwing Sherman tanks to dig out the tenacious Japanese troops from their heavily fortified defenses in the craggy hillsides. At sea, the U.S. invasion force was subjected to the continual scourge of fierce kamikaze attacks. For the men of both sides, it was to be an appalling ordeal. A Marine later recalled, "Men struggled, fought, and bled in an environment so degrading that I believed we had been flung into God's own cesspool." For the tough American commander, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, and the resolute Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, it was to be a deadly clash of warriors. The successful American reoccupation of the Philippine Islands, which began in January 1945, had forced the Japanese back closer to their homeland. The conquest of Iwo Jima by the end of March offered U.S. forces a base near Japan that could provide fighter support and emergency landing facilities for Marianas-based aircraft attacking the Japanese mainland. The U.S. long-range bombing campaign against Japan resulted in hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilian deaths in early 1945. In one raid alone against Tokyo, over 100,000 were killed, largely as a result of the firestorms caused by incendiary bombs, which devastated the wood structures of much of the city. As the former Japanese empire crumbled, Okinawa became the next logical step for the Allies in their drive toward the Japanese mainland. The U.S. military needed to capture Okinawa for 3 crucial reasons. First, it would allow American medium-range bombers to reach Japan. Second, the supply lines from southeast China would be severed, cutting off the last link to a resource-hungry Japan. Finally, once in U.S. hands, Okinawa could be used as a springboard for a full-blooded Allied invasion of Japan itself. The success or failure of the Okinawa offensive would be decided by the skill and leadership of General Buckner and General Ushijima. Simon Bolivar Buckner was born in 1886, the son of a leading Civil War Confederate general. In 1908, he was selected to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he excelled as a student. Buckner graduated in 1912 and was commissioned into the infantry. In 1917, Captain Buckner qualified as a pilot, although he returned to the infantry in 1918 and remained stateside during World War I. Regarded as an outstanding officer among his peers, he was an instructor at West Point between 1919 and 1923. A decade later, Colonel Buckner was appointed Commandant, a mark of his growing reputation in the U.S. Army. In June 1940, he was promoted to Brigadier General and led the U.S. Alaska Defense Command. He was responsible for countering a possible Japanese invasion. Following the Japanese landings in the Aleutian Islands in 1942, Buckner was instrumental in recapturing them in May 1943. In June 1944, he prepared the U.S. 10th Army for the attack on Okinawa. Buckner was a physically tough and hard-nosed commander. He was highly regarded by his men for his forthright and decisive leadership. Mitsuru Uchijima was born near Tokyo in 1887. He served as an infantry officer in the Japanese Army from age 22, after attending the military academy in Tokyo. As a junior officer, Ushijima served in China during World War I in the short campaign to capture German possessions there. He demonstrated a natural gift for infantry tactics. In between the two wars, Ushijima served in Manchuria as a battalion and then regimental commander. He also served on the general staff in Tokyo. By 1940, Major General Ushijima was commanding an infantry division. In early 1942, he led his division during the spectacular conquest of Burma. In the summer of the same year, Lieutenant General Ushijima was appointed Commandant of the Japanese Military Academy in Tokyo. In early 1944, he was sent to organize the defenses of the island of Iwo Jima as the American war machine continued to roll back the boundaries of the Japanese Empire. Ushijima was appointed commander of the 32nd Army on Okinawa and prepared to employ his undoubted talents as a master tactician and defense expert. Like Buckner, Ushijima was a commander who was highly regarded and trusted by his men. They were inspired by his cool, decisive leadership. Both Buckner and Ushijima drew up elaborate plans for what they knew would be an uncompromising struggle for the island of Okinawa.
Clash of Warriors will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
Conquest of Iwo Jima in March 1945 cost them a staggering 26,000 casualties. The 21,000-strong Japanese garrison, whose defenses were largely planned by Ushijima, had fought with great ferocity. Buckner estimated that Okinawa was defended by about 70,000 Japanese troops. 70 miles long, Okinawa was 60 times the size of Iwo Jima. It was characterized by craggy terrain, low-lying valleys, steep cliffs on the coast, and fortified villages and strong points. The naval commander, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, and Buckner had to plan the invasion with the island's geography in mind. They knew that the capture of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was a formidable undertaking. Buckner and Turner gathered together a joint naval, air, and land force of almost 250,000 men. The planned date for the landings on Okinawa was Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, which was designated as Love Day. For the offensive, Buckner divided his 10th Army into two, the Northern and Southern attack forces. They would be assisted by a naval amphibious support element and a covering force largely of aircraft carriers. He would also carry out a diversionary action southeast of the island. Buckner expected Ushijima to fully defend Okinawa. To assist the landings, Buckner planned an unprecedented preliminary 6-day naval and air bombardment against Ushijima's defenses. Once the invasion forces were ashore and the beachhead established, 10th Army would cut the island in two. Then clear Okinawa with 2 rapid drives to the north by 2 Marine divisions and south with 2 infantry divisions. The invasion force was protected at sea by a massive Allied fleet. Most important were the carriers and aircraft of the covering force, which threw a radar protection screen around the entire invasion fleet to detect and destroy kamikaze air attacks. Buckner never doubted that Ushijima's troops would fight ferociously from the outset. He ensured that his men were given the necessary weapons and equipment to facilitate their task. Flamethrowers were essential for tackling Japanese strongpoints. Tanks provided vital close support for the infantry. Buckner also had plentiful artillery, both self-propelled and conventional wheeled guns. He also possessed multiple launch rocket systems. Bazookas were highly effective bunker busters. Mortars provided close-range fire support. Grenades, some fired from rifles, were crucial for close-quarter combat. Buckner knew that Japanese resistance would be fierce, but hoped Ushijima lacked resources which could prolong the fighting. On Okinawa, Ushijima had been planning for the inevitable American assault for several months. He had been sent to Okinawa with orders to hold it to the last man while exacting the highest possible toll on Buckner's 10th Army. The Japanese High Command planned a series of spectacular attacks by air and sea to disrupt and even destroy Buckner's invasion forces. The most prominent would be the now infamous kamikaze strikes. The Japanese planned to deploy air-launched piloted flying bombs known as Oka, or cherry blossoms. They also intended to launch suicide attacks by sea, first with over 350 suicide boats known as Renraku-tei. They planned to run these small craft packed with explosives alongside U.S. ships and then detonate them. Another naval weapon was the one-man Kaiten submarine. Based on the highly successful human torpedo, the airman would direct the Kaiten toward its target and then bail out just before it struck. Finally, the battleship Yamato was to attack the invasion fleet and then beach itself, creating a fortress and firing its huge guns at the enemy to its destruction. All the suicide missions would depend on luck. By now, the Americans were capable of reacting to such attacks with a massive and deadly response. Ushijima would use kamikaze attacks, but he knew that he could not rely on them. He planned to defend Okinawa by making Buckner's men pay for every yard gained. Ushijima decided not to defend the coast, but to concentrate his forces inland. The bulk of his 32nd Army would defend the south, with a holding force in the Motobu Peninsula. Garrisons were also stationed on the southwestern Kerama and Kiese Islands, and on the northwest island of Ieshima. Ushijima intended to fight his main battle in the south of Okinawa, using the Machinato Line and the even stronger defenses of the Shuri Line. If needed, he would withdraw the remnants of his force to a final defensive position based on the Itoma Line to make his last stand. Ushijima expected his men to fight to the end. He did not intend to surrender. The Japanese 32nd Army was comprised of the veteran 62nd Infantry Division, which had previously fought in Burma and China. The 24th Infantry Division had been assigned to Okinawa from Manchuria and had a reputation for ruthlessness and toughness. Ushijima also had an independent brigade and a brigade of naval infantry. These were sailors who had been assigned an infantry role, but were barely trained for their task. In addition, there were the 20,000 members of the Okinawan Home Guard, or Boitai, giving Ushijima a grand total of 120,000 men, more than Buckner expected to confront. The 32nd Army was well supplied with artillery guns and mortars of all calibers. It also had a tank regiment. By late March 1945, Ushijima prepared the Okinawa bastion in a masterly fashion. He planned token resistance at the beachhead and then strengthened his forces closer inland to the defense lines in the south. Minefields, tank traps, and specially trained screen forces armed with light weapons and machine guns were deployed to guard the approaches to the hills. Behind this screen lay the Machinato Line. It ran across a series of craggy approaches covered by machine guns, artillery observers, mortars, and a number of well-concealed infantry squads who would fight to the death. But the main defense was centered on the Shuri Line. It was an awesome and formidable position in which Ushijima had deployed heavy machine guns, mortars, anti-tank, and artillery. The ace in Ushijima's defensive pack was the seemingly endless honeycomb of caves and tunnels which the troops inhabited. Many were man-made, dug out of the hillside by thousands of Japanese civilians who lived on the island. The caves and tunnels linked strong points and sniper positions with bolt holes and ammunition stores, catering facilities, and even underground hospitals. Ushijima's primary tactics would be to isolate Buckner's infantry and Marines from their protecting tanks. The armor would be halted by artillery from the hills, then attacked by Japanese tank destroyer teams using high explosive charges. The crews would be shot as they attempted to escape from their blazing vehicles. The American infantry would then be pinned down by ferocious Japanese counterattacks. By the end of March 1945, Ushijima was well prepared for Buckner's imminent offensive against Okinawa. A desperate battle loomed.
Clash of Warriors will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
next month on the History Channel.
Your pet's exact same heartworm and flea medications delivered to your door for less than you're paying now.
It costs less than buying from my veterinarian.
It only takes a phone call.
I saved a visit to my vet's office. I didn't have to leave home.
Pet Meds delivers my pet's medication right to my door.
It's cheaper and more convenient than buying from my vet.
I saved time and money.
1-888-PET-MEDS. We deliver savings and convenience on HeartGuard, Advantage, Frontline, and all other pet medications. Call to order now or order online.
Atlantis, once upon our time. Book by April 30th and save up to 25%.
Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies, for amber waves of green.
Coming face to face with freedom is to journey into the landscape of a nation's vision and pride, and to carry it with you in your heart forever.
America, America.
To be astonished by the sheer majesty of nature, inspired by the wondrous works of human endeavor.
And crown thy good with brotherhood.
Feel the spirit of America. Call now for your vacation guide. South Dakota. Come face to face with freedom.
The History Channel now returns to Clash of Warriors.
Morale among Buckner's troops was high, especially when they learned that Love Day was to be April 1st, 1945, or April Fool's Day. After the bloody battles already fought in the Pacific, especially the costly storming of Iwo Jima only weeks before, most Americans expected a bloodbath from the moment they hit the beaches of Okinawa. Few believed that they would overwhelm Ushijima's men. They knew that each Japanese soldier would fight to the death, and Buckner's Marines and infantrymen had to be trained to deal with this. They had developed special tactics for overcoming Japanese resistance. The troops would rely on specially rigged explosive charges to destroy underground enemy positions. Tanks also had a key role to play. Conventional gun tanks and Shermans equipped with flamethrowers worked closely with the infantry. The troops could also take comfort from the fact that aside from kamikaze attacks, Japanese air power had been almost destroyed. Japan's navy had also virtually ceased to exist. The men of Ushijima's 32nd Army prepared a defense and were resolved to fight to make Okinawa a graveyard for thousands of Americans. Their determination was instilled first by the samurai traditions of courage and honor, which taught that surrender was not an option. It was reinforced by their continued devotion to Hirohito, their god emperor. They had renewed vigor and purpose. Under Ushijima, they believed that they had a sacred mission to defend their homeland. They believed that if the Americans were frustrated on Okinawa, Japan could become an impregnable fortress. Ushijima's men would also be fighting to protect the 400,000 Okinawan civilians who were also prepared to die rather than fall into American hands. Ushijima had absolute faith in his men and knew that they would fight on whatever the odds. On the evening of March 31st, 1945, the American and Japanese troops stood poised for the imminent battle. The men of Buckner's 10th Army prayed that the Japanese resistance on the next day would not prove as fierce as they had experienced on Iwo Jima. The tension was just as great for Simon Bolivar Buckner and his opponent, Mitsuru Ushijima.
Clash of Warriors will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
What's up, Mr. Foster?
I go in for a PC, I come out with a migraine. You ask for this, all they have is that. Makes your head spin.
Well, your computer quandary is easily solved by the folks at Dell. Just call or go online. They'll help you figure it out, so you know what you're getting and what you're getting it for.
So none of this?
Nope, just the perfect PC for you at the right price for you.
Oh, I'm feeling better already.
Good.
Stephen, isn't this your father's car?
No.
Right now, a complete Dimension desktop with an Intel Pentium 4 processor delivering performance where you need it most is just $699. And why wait? Because for a limited time, you can get free shipping. There's great deals on notebooks, too.
You're gonna say it, aren't you?
Oh, he knows.
Easy to buy, easy to own, easy as Dell. Dell PCs use Intel Pentium 4 processors.
Tomorrow on the History Channel.
Prior to the Okinawa landings on April 1st, 1945, Buckner's men had carried out 2 successful preliminary operations against offshore islands. On March 26th, Buckner's men stormed ashore and overran Kerama. Here they discovered and destroyed the Japanese suicide boats intended to attack the main invasion fleet. On the 28th, Buckner secured Kiese Island, from which U.S. Navy artillery would be able to support his troops on Okinawa. For 6 days prior to the landings, a massive preliminary aerial and naval bombardment pulverized the planned invasion beachheads and known enemy defenses inland. At last, Love Day, April 1st arrived, and the invasion force advanced to Okinawa. While the bombardment continued, the first waves of Buckner's 170,000 assault troops closed in on the landing beaches. As the landing craft ramps were lowered, the Marines and infantrymen of 4 divisions rushed across the sand, ready to take cover as soon as the enemy opened fire. The assault troops began to advance off the beaches, expecting a Japanese riposte, which never came. Within 3 hours, Buckner's assault troops had secured the beachheads, and by the end of Love Day, 75,000 troops were ashore. By April 4th, they had cut the island in 2, in a fraction of the time expected, and with few casualties. It seemed too good to be true. American war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote, "The carnage that is almost inevitable on an invasion was wonderfully and beautifully not there." A battle-hardened infantryman of 7th Division told his comrades, "I've already lived longer than I dared hope to." The relief of avoiding a stiff battle for the beachhead was palpable as reinforcements and supplies were brought ashore. Buckner now set the next phase of Operation Iceberg in motion. Late April 4th, the Marines set out to clear the northern part of the island, including the Motobu Peninsula. Simultaneously, the two infantry divisions of 24th Corps began to swing south and clear the southern sector of Okinawa, including the capital, Naha. Ushijima continued to keep his main defensive positions concealed. On April 5th, the battleship Yamato was dispatched to Okinawa with no fuel for a return journey. She was to attack Buckner's shipping, then act as a floating fortress to inflict as much damage as possible. But this suicide mission was aborted by attacks from 300 U.S. carrier-borne aircraft. The Yamato was sunk long before it reached its target. More ominously, the anticipated kamikaze attacks against Buckner's shipping had also begun. They had already flown some missions. But from April 6th onward, the attacks intensified, causing further casualties to Allied ships. Back on land, the U.S. Marine divisions raced across the northern part of Okinawa against little opposition until they reached the head of the Motobu Peninsula on April 9th. As they advanced into the peninsula, they confronted the 2,000-strong Udo force, named after its commander, Colonel Matsuri Udo. For 12 days, Udo's well-entrenched men held on against almost impossible odds until they were finally wiped out. Udo's dogged stand cost the Marines almost 1,000 casualties. On April 16th, Buckner sent his 77th Division against the island of Ieshima off Okinawa's northwest coast. The GI secured it after 5 days of fighting. Almost 5,500 of Ushijima's 7,000 defenders were killed. Remarkably, almost 200 were taken prisoner. By the third week in April, the central region of Okinawa was in American hands. The Marines had also raced rapidly northward and then along the east coast. The Americans were now in a position to bring captured airfields into operation and use them to provide further air support for the ground forces. In the south, it was proving to be a very different story. On April 5th, the 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions had swung south as the Marines began their northern drive. At first, they made good progress. But on April 9th, both infantry divisions began to encounter increasingly stiff opposition along Ushijima's Machinato line. They were met by a series of fortified escarpments and ridges, the most prominent and formidable of which was Kakazu Ridge. Buckner threw both divisions against the Machinato line, with the 96th Division assaulting Kakazu Ridge. From the outset, the fighting was fierce, brutal, and unrelenting. The two U.S. divisions were pinned down and unable to make any progress against Ushijima's troops, who fought back from superbly sited and strongly fortified positions. Buckner's men assaulted the Japanese strongpoints one by one, taking them after murderous struggles. By April 13th, as casualties mounted rapidly, Buckner was forced to change his tactics. The frontal assaults were proving too costly. On the same day, Ushijima's Machinato line was subjected to a concentrated artillery barrage. It continued throughout that night. Kakazu Ridge was assaulted by further regiments of 96th Division, but Ushijima's men, deep underground and virtually untouched by the American artillery, would not budge. Still, the American casualties mounted. The attack faltered again, and fierce Japanese counterattacks got behind the advancing Americans. Sergeant Beaufort T. Anderson, a mortar platoon non-com, and his men were isolated by the onrush. Anderson ordered his men to take cover in an old tomb, and then, armed only with a carbine, faced the enemy onslaught alone. As the enemy rushed in, he seized an unexploded Japanese mortar bomb and threw it back toward the attackers, which exploded, killing or wounding several of the Japanese. He then repeated this with his own mortar shells. Anderson forced them to withdraw, saving his own men and killing at least 25 Japanese. After the war, President Truman gave him the Medal of Honor. But the Machinato line still remained in Ushijima's hands. Buckner's plan to quickly secure Okinawa was unraveling before his eyes, and he knew that he had to do something drastic and fast. Buckner came ashore on April 14th and told his field commanders that he expected them to break through the Machinato line immediately. To assist, he brought in a 3rd Infantry Division, the 27th, to reinforce the battered 96th and 7th Divisions. Then, on April 19th, all 3 divisions prepared to attack after the most concentrated artillery bombardment of the Pacific War. 19,000 shells in a matter of hours. As Buckner observed the battle, the attack again met stiff opposition, and the 27th Division lost 22 of its 30 tanks in its first action. Despite extreme pressure, Ushijima's defenders stood firm. Buckner himself came under severe pressure from the naval commanders, especially Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He was concerned at Buckner's slow progress while his ships were becoming vulnerable to kamikaze attacks. Nimitz told Buckner, "I am losing a ship and a half a day, so if this line isn't moving within 5 days, we'll get someone here to move it so we can all get out from under these stupid air attacks." But constant bludgeoning against the Machinato line finally forced Ushijima to withdraw in the last days of April. The remnants of the Japanese 32nd Army were now concentrated behind the even stronger Shuri line at the southern end of Okinawa. Meanwhile, in the nearby waters, the kamikaze attacks reached their highest level of the war. Over 3,000 pilots were to eventually attack the U.S. fleet, sinking 36 and damaging 38 vessels. Worse, Ushijima was planning to launch a counteroffensive. On May 1st, Buckner's plan for the capture of Okinawa was hanging by a thread that might just be cut by a bold move by Ushijima. Furthermore, it might force an American withdrawal from the southern part of Okinawa and buy the Japanese even more precious time. Buckner's increasingly exhausted troops might not only fail to break through the seemingly impregnable Japanese defensive lines, but soon be under attack themselves. It also began to rain, and much of the battlefield was turned into a quagmire. For the American troops, it seemed that things could not get any worse in Okinawa.
Clash of Warriors will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
Between May 1st and 3rd, 1945, Buckner rearranged his front lines and brought in the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions to support the weary divisions in the south. At the same time, Ushijima planned to launch a series of counterattacks against Buckner's reorganizing formations. These had been proposed by his trusted operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, and Chief of Staff Major General Isamu Cho. They overcame Ushijima's doubts over the idea. Though he knew that the attacks were a huge gamble, Ushijima accepted that they could alter the course of the battle in his favor. The plan was to launch amphibious assaults on Buckner's coastal flanks to divert his attention, while simultaneously assaulting with a full infantry brigade of 3,000 men, supported by tanks against the center of the American line. The attacks, launched on May 3rd, were dogged by misfortune from the start. First, American naval units and then the U.S. 1st Marine Division spotted the amphibious assaults and literally blew them out of the water. There were no survivors. The infantry brigade forming up to carry out Ushijima's ground offensive was also spotted and struck down by Buckner's aircraft and artillery. The last planned Japanese offensive of World War II ended in disaster. Ushijima lost most of his battle-experienced troops. Worse, it had revealed the extent of the Shuri Line. This meant that Buckner could now plan to break through it with more confidence. The final brutal and bloody act of the drama on Okinawa was about to begin. Throughout the remainder of May 1945, Buckner's forces fought tooth and nail to pry the Japanese defenders out from their heavily fortified strongpoints in the hills. Even as the defenders of the Shuri Line dwindled, it seemed to Buckner's exhausted men that the survivors fought with even greater ferocity. In most cases, only high explosives and flames fired from the supporting Shermans could finally destroy Japanese resistance. But the resistance and Buckner's men suffered even more casualties. The unrelenting American pressure finally forced Ushijima to withdraw. Ushijima conducted his withdrawal with great skill, and his remaining troops were soon firm in their final defensive line. Ushijima set up his headquarters in a cave complex. It was here that he had resolved to continue the struggle to the last and die fighting. U.S. air power pounded the Japanese defenses. But Ushijima's men continued to inflict casualties. The American troops were forced to treat each Japanese strongpoint as a major operation on its own. Amid mounting casualties, Buckner's men slowly made inroads on the Japanese defenses. On June 18th, tragedy struck the Americans. Simon Bolivar Buckner became the highest-ranking casualty of the Pacific Theater. He was at a forward observation post, watching further U.S. landings with his staff, when a brief Japanese artillery barrage hit the area. Though the rest of his men were untouched, Buckner was hit in the chest by a shell fragment and seriously wounded. He died en route to the casualty station. Lieutenant General Vinegar Joe Stilwell assumed command of 10th Army within the next week. 3 days after Buckner's death, on the evening of June 21st, Ushijima and his Chief of Staff Isamu Cho committed suicide as the U.S. forces closed in on their headquarters cave on the southern tip of Okinawa. Both commanders died just as the battle finally drew to an end. The Okinawa campaign was the first in which a significant number of Japanese prisoners, over 7,000, were taken. Well over 110,000 were killed in action, with an estimated 24,000 entombed in the caves. Civilian casualties were also high. Fearing U.S. brutality, many committed suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs. Americans suffered 12,500 losses and 35,000 wounded, the highest casualty tally for any of the campaigns in the Pacific. At sea, over 5,000 naval and naval air personnel were lost. 38 U.S. ships were sunk and 368 damaged, mainly by the kamikazes. These were alarmingly high losses so close to the end of the war, and demonstrated the increasing fanaticism of many of the Japanese troops as the Allies closed in on their homeland. Simon Bolivar Buckner was buried on Okinawa. His body was exhumed 4 years later and laid to rest in the family grave in Kentucky. He was posthumously promoted to 4-star general in 1954. Buckner's untimely death in the hour of victory was a tragedy, and his men mourned him. Mitsuru Ushijima committed suicide as a final act of defiance after his men could do no more to halt the American advance. The relentless, savage battle for Okinawa was an indication of the enormous scale of casualties that might have been incurred in a full-blooded invasion of the Japanese mainland. Another option was chosen. On August 6, 1945, 6 weeks after the fall of Okinawa, the American B-29 superfortress known as Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It was followed shortly afterward by a similar attack on Nagasaki. Japan finally ceded, and the war in the Pacific ended. Neither Simon Bolivar Buckner nor Mitsuru Ushijima lived to witness it. Theirs had been the ultimate clash of warriors.
Watch Hollywood come face to face